Our topic today is, of course, women in public leadership, why multilateralism matters. It is unbelievable to hear some of the stories from the morning sessions, and I think it really spoke to what we need to be seeing at home, so at the micro level, and then what we need to see at the macro level with policy. Can we really see change when it comes to equality and getting women into leadership roles if we don't change things in the homes, to the boardrooms, to work, to eventually in policy leadership roles as well? Just a quick note, Her Excellency Rania will have to leave early, but we will try and get to you as quickly as possible because you've got another engagement. You've got lots of panel discussions that you're doing. So welcome to all of you. Great to see you. Your Excellency, Dr. Rania, I'm going to start with you, and you've been listening to some of the commentary as well. Multilateralism is your thing. You know, global cooperation is something that you're very engaged with. I want to touch on some of the issues facing the world right now. Firstly, we've taken many steps back because of the pandemic when it comes to gender equality and girls going to school, specifically in emerging markets. Let's take a look at what's happening in Afghanistan, for example, where the Taliban is afraid of what it means to educate a young girl. And then we hear, broad statements of, if there were women in leadership roles when it comes to the crisis in Eastern Europe, would we really be talking about World War III and nuclear? Give me a sense of where we are right now and whether you think we can move forward.
Thank you very much, Lini, and I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank Minister Ahoud for the invitation. Multilateralism is, and as we saw in the very first panel, the fire chat that happened in the morning, we need to create a consensus on topics to be able to push the global agenda. And one of the common denominators that really creates more, appealing push forward is the point on gender. And let me go back from my days at the IMF as a staff member. This was before the managing director, Christine Lagarde, took office. And we used to have brown bag lunches to actually push women on missions in countries that were considered big portfolios. Later on, you had the managing director, first female, leading the IMF. And for the very first time, gender became mainstream in discussions of IMF programs in countries. Why is this significant? It's significant because, as we saw in the earlier discussions, the gender agenda is not only a government agenda, it's not only a private sector agenda or a civil society agenda, it's a stakeholder engagement agenda. Each one has a role to play. So when we have multilateral institutions pushing that forward, and we have SDG number 5, gender equality, one of the key SDGs that countries focus on, as we saw earlier also, because it's cross-cutting other SDGs. We find that by this concept of trying to, and I don't want to focus on statistics, but the idea that international institutions have actually quantified in terms of GDP, in terms of productivity, in terms of additional wages that men can get if women are more engaged in economy. All of these has pushed to a very different way through which multilateral institutions, governments, private sector are taking the gender objective very seriously in the work. So this I think is what I want to start with, that the gender agenda is a common denominator. It is one that creates consensus when it comes to the global agenda. You mentioned Taliban, you mentioned other examples. These are examples which are condemned by the international community because there is more consensus around the gender agenda.
Fascinating. Look, we know that women in the workplace are incredibly important, and it's quantifiable data that we can look at. But not all women have the same opportunities, and the gap is enormous. The least developed economies in the world face a very different, set of issues than what we're seeing in other parts of the world. Your Excellency Preeti, thank you very much for joining us. There's this example, and I try and keep this woman in the back of my mind every time I do a panel discussion and she comes up. The woman in the village, in a remote village in Rwanda, with a baby on her back, picking chilies for half of the wage to other people because she has to take breaks to nurse her baby. Yep. Will she ever really get economic emancipation? Will she ever really be able to break the poverty cycle with her children? because her husband has abandoned her and maybe even government has abandoned her. So how do we keep her at the heart of everything we do in policy?
Thank you, Eleni. And the answer would be yes. It's challenging, but that's one role that multilateralism should have. So in this case, I represent the United Nations, in particular the United Nations Capital Development Fund, where we do finance the 46 of the least developed countries. And the solution would be local government and digital, right? So what we're trying to do is not stay at the sovereign level, but really take the financing down to the municipalities, to the local level. And the municipalities do cover then this woman in the village. But the sad part is still we find that the budget given to the local governments is quite low. So one example is the upzillas in Bangladesh. Only 3% of the local budget itself goes to women's empowerment. So we're trying to push more gender responsive investment into the local government level. And we hope that that will reach the villages and the rural women, because you're right, of the 3.9 billion people in the world that don't have access to internet or energy, most of them are in the rural area, and most of them are women and children. The next part would be to use digital solutions, because digital perhaps could overcome the infrastructure lack that we have. So one example was in Uganda. We helped MTN put up a tower. We gave a guarantee because MTN was not willing to put up a telephone tower in Uganda. And then 6,000 coffee farmers were able to get digital payments from the coffee exporter. So we felt that having digital payments makes sure that the money reaches the last mile, reaches the farmer, and hopefully we'll try to get more of the margin back to the farmer. So those would be some examples. But just to say, the idea for me would be pushing convening, pushing financing, and pushing accountability. And we try to do this within the UN as well. We have a UN SWAP, System-Wide Action Plan, but I'd like to focus on financing for today.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Your Excellency, Mohieldin, and you're also a former minister in Egypt as well. I want to get a sense, because it's so great to have a male that's pushing the female agenda on our panel. And thank you very much for joining us. When we look at the foundations of what it's going to take to ensure that women have an equal playing field, the system right now doesn't work across the board. If you're a mother, you might find it more difficult to be able to do, to do the balancing act. Policies and corporates are not conducive to allowing women to get to leadership roles, or sometimes women fall out of the prospect of that because they have so much more to do than male colleagues. How do you foresee the change in the system itself to alleviate some of the pressure that we've seen with inequality?
It's very interesting as well to be part of the endangered speeches. I think I'm the only man for quite some time in any panel today. So I think our good colleague Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF used to say, well, if there is no woman in the panel, there is no panel. So I think we need really now about time to say, if there is no man, there should be no panel as well. So, but anyways, this is the positive side of the story. But actually, we're not doing that good. It's good that you mentioned evidence and data. Yes, there are some good examples from some individual cases, like here in the UAE, in education, in health access, in finance and inclusion to finance, in matters related to participation in government and parliament. We heard good examples as well from Egypt, from Seychelles, and from Morocco. But if you see this report that just came out from the UNICEF about the regional SDG data, this is the Regional Economic Commission of the Arab countries based in Beirut. Actually, there had been a great deal of deterioration in the Arab countries, and actually worse than what's happening worldwide after COVID-19. Consider the following. If there is a shock, women are exposed more. If there is poverty, women will be more impoverished. If there is inequality, they will be more excluded. This is the issue of vulnerability here. So any kind of meaningful action needs really to prioritize women in terms of access to finance, in terms of investments. So what could be the role of the multilateral system here? We are very happy to see women in the leadership. IMF managing director, the head of WTO, number 2 at the UN. But there is a role of the multilateral system to deal with the challenges that you are putting for us to solve. First is the convening power that these organizations put. standard setting? Are we really benchmarking ourselves to ourselves or to some international norms that are getting better than what we are locally and nationally? Then the technical assistance, the financial support. This could come from the World Bank, from the IMF. In the case of the IMF that I'm working at, there are two things that we're doing. First, on budget. If there is no mainstreaming of gender aspects and budget, can just talk forever, and then we don't see any results. So if your budget is not really reflecting what the leadership and the society at large is not really pushing for, there should be something very wrong. The other aspect is about financial inclusion, and I'm happy that through digitalization, and we saw some good examples, we have been seeing some great improvement of women participation, but we need to invest in the infrastructure, the access to internet. And then you don't need just to talk about urban centers. It's good that you mentioned villages, because when we saw issues related to financial inclusion, if you happen to be a woman under the age of 25 in a rural area, so we are more likely to be excluded from finance and financial service by 5 to 10%. So here is basically the kind of action that we need to have. The good thing is that we have the tools and the financial means and the good monitoring and evaluation tools that could really help us monitoring what's happening.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rania, I want to come to you because I know you need to leave quite soon, so I'm just going to focus on Dr. Rania for a bit. Why do you think the gains that we've made when it comes to women and children are so fragile that every time we see an economic shock, it is the women that pay the price? We've got higher food inflation coming up. What is this going to mean? It's going to compound everything that we've seen, the pain that we've seen incurred by the pandemic.
You know, it is true that the vulnerable groups by nature, when there's a crisis, they are disproportionately affected. So your point on the fragility of women is because women are still lying in the vulnerable group, correct? What has been happening over the past years, and I see this as a positive in the midst of what's gloomy, is that the gender agenda is pushed on the forefront when it comes to government policies, and also when it comes to government engaging with the international community. And let me give you examples. We have to design our 5-year strategies with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the United Nations Sustainable Development Framework. And there are 3 words that come up in all of these strategies: inclusion, digital, and green. And when we're talking about inclusion, it's about the vulnerable and the women. When we're talking about digital, we just heard about the digital divide, so women as a group come in. And when we talk about green, it's also linked to women because they are the ones that, if it's adaptation issues, they are the ones that feel the brunt, and therefore they have to be at the front seat when it comes to advocacy and trying to find solutions. Let me just say that all of us have never dealt with so many shocks at the same time in this time horizon. We have just finished COVID. Almost. Sort of, we're not sure yet, but at least psychologically. And the fiscal space that exists for governments, the fiscal space that exists for the private sector, the amount of reorientation that women had to go through, children had to go through, was enormous. And now we have a compounded 3 shocks: commodity prices, oil prices, and then the uncertainty related to capital flows. All of these shocks coming at the same time are retrenching many of the agendas, not just the gender agenda. So I don't want us to be sort of I don't want to say too harsh, but the gender agenda is part of many other strategies, and all of them are being not put on the back burner, but there's more challenge in trying to achieve them going forward. Let me just on the gender issue, because there's a concept which I love to use, and this was when the IMF started their work on gender, and it was very strange that the institution that calls for monetary and financial stability in the world is talking about gender. And there's a very important phrase that was used in the first paper that came out from the IMF, and that women participation is macro-critical. So if we believe that in order to push macro stability, if we believe that governments today or economies need to be more productive, and we're talking about macro stability, women's engagement becomes important. So what I'm saying is that despite all the challenges we're facing and the idea that many of the agendas of development are being pushed back, we still have a lot of justification and a lot of goodwill and commitment from governments, from private sector, and from the international community in the multilateral system on the gender agenda. If there's something that everybody sort of agrees on, is gender. You know, we can sit down and discuss many other topics, but when it comes to gender, if we take a sample of 100 people in the room, probably 95% of the people are going to be in agreement with whatever Eleni is going to say on the panel.
Okay, so Dr. Rania, before we say goodbye to you, and this is something I think about very deeply because, you know, I'm in the news flow. I cover the stories, you know, we see coming out of Afghanistan. It is absolutely devastating and depressing. We see maternity wards being targeted in war zones. We see what's happening in the likes of Yemen and how women and children are bearing the brunt of it. When we talk about a multilateral approach, it still perplexes me that women and children are always bearing the biggest brunt of what we see because of bad decisions being made, right, in boardrooms at policy level. What do you think needs to change the needle on that, where
you know,
even in crisis we have an equal spread of trauma?
Let me tell you that during the panels this morning, we heard about the idea of showing examples, role models or examples. And let me take the country Egypt, where I belong. We have 5 million refugees. We don't call them refugees. They are integrated in our society. The women, children, the healthcare, the education, and so forth. So to take that example, and we don't speak about it enough in global fora. This is an example of the displaced from Yemen, Sudan, Syria, and lately Lebanon coming to Egypt and being integrated in society. So that is one example. This is, I'm not justifying wars that lead to refugees or displacement. All I'm saying is we have examples of dealing with it where even at the time of crisis, because they were there when COVID happened, so vaccines had to be availed, the healthcare, etc. So there are some examples that we need to show so that international institutions, in dealing with the fallout from these crises, can actually make it integrated in policy. Wars will not end, unfortunately. This is a fact. As long as humans exist, wars will continue for whatever reason, and it's not just, I'm not just talking about the current situation, but what happens is all of us, I don't want to say pay a price, but are being affected, and there's a role for each one of us. Governments, private sector, civil society, and the multilateral institutions. And what I'm seeing from where I am as Minister of International Cooperation is that there is more focus today on trying to streamline or align the policies of these different stakeholders. We're trying to do it internally, and we're trying to also advocate that on the international stage.
Dr. Rania, thank you so much. A round of applause for Dr. Rania. You have to go. You've got another important panel to go to. Thank you so much. And leaving us with a lot of food for thought, Your Excellency Preeti. I love looking at macro and micro level, and in a way that the big financing institutions and the big institutions are looking at funding and how that can trickle down to the people that need it most. How are you seeing the funding right now towards your agendas, and specifically on gender equality, and whether there's any signs of concern, because we're seeing a lot of focus being shifted. Firstly, it was healthcare, right? And now we're seeing a shift towards defense.
Thanks, Eleni, again. So I think the emphasis is there. Now we need action. So, this year we've seen the Generation Equality Forum. So institutions like the US are involved in 2X initiatives. So we are seeing funding happen. Let me give perhaps two ideas about what we are doing. We are focused on public and private financing. So while the public financing, a lot of governments here, and again, acknowledging the government of the UAE for inviting us as well, that in Senegal, we took the public sector FONSIS, Sovereign Wealth Fund, and created a women's fund, a WE fund, WEE. And we've got about $15 million in there now, a mixture of public and private capital, so that we can invest in women enterprises in Senegal. So we are trying to make such steps. But as the minister was saying, it's a combination of policies. So you've got to start with the policies, get women inclusion into those policies, and then go into financing structures. So we feel that there is a good emphasis. Now we need to work on the action plans. So Generation Equality Forum, such structures. And a particular example I like is out in Bangladesh, Singapore. We are partnering with IIX, the Women's Livelihood Bonds. That's a way of channeling institutional capital from the capital markets projects into women SMEs through a public bond listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. So lots of structuring to be done, but we need the power of the women to come up with those enterprises, and we need to support that.
Absolutely, and that's really encouraging and very exciting. The IMF, of course, and we've ascertained this, that they, you as an institution has been really at the forefront for a long time now in focusing on, gender-related programs and capacity building within that space. What's your assessment, sir, on the way that low-income countries and least developed economies are faring within this space? Are you concerned that because of the shocks that we're seeing, we could see even bigger regression?
Yes, with all of these shocks that we have been seeing, COVID-19 included the threat of climate change as well, because there is a great deal of vulnerability when it comes to women. Actually, there are very striking statistics that women are 14 times more vulnerable than men in the cases of natural disasters associated with climate change. It's not 14%, it's not 140%, it's 14 times in the cases that have been tested in exposure to natural disaster because of severe weather changes and climate change. And then we see the impact of COVID-19. We mentioned the figures of poverty. We mentioned the issues related to loss of jobs, malnutrition problems, and then with the vulnerability again of food, finance, and fuel, again, the vulnerability of women is higher. So anything that we can do in these kind of three strategies that are being adopted by the IMF. One is the gender strategy. Second one is about digitalization. And the third is about sustainability. And these three strategies are very much reinforcing each other. But basically, what's linking them together is basically finance. Because you can really, at the end of the day, you can talk about ambitious goals, ambitious aspirational targets of SDGs, and then Vision 2030 for many countries are adopting, but basically, if you don't really have the budget of the state to start us with, we are not going to be getting the kind of private sector involved, because there is a kind of a very big mistake when we put emphasis on the business sector and the private sector without really knowing what the budget of the state is going to be providing. Is it going to be crowding in the private sector? Is it going to be crowding out the private sector? So I think the natural starting point is from the budget of the state, where the accountability could be there. The parliament can really be checking if really the government and the leadership are basically delivering on what they claim. And then we can really see the investment opportunities. Having said that, we need really to be guided by good evidence as well, and it's good that Mr. Abdullah Lutai is with us here, and he's been doing a great job in statistics, because in all countries, including relatively rich countries like what we see in the GCC, they are always constrained by funding. So we need always to be guided by good data in order to prioritize better. And then the issues related to implementation. Implementation here is not through the multilateral system. Yeah. It's through localization of the work. When you see the communities connected and they see the impact of these investments and spending in their local communities, that could be realized. We know that the hard way. In cases of Colombia, Rwanda, and Liberia, what's there in common between those three countries? That all of them went through tough times 20 or 30 years ago. Three countries enjoy great leadership role of women, but they discovered that after civil unrest, civil war, and problems, that then they discovered that the women, if they are given a chance, they could really be peace builders. They could really monitor what's happening at the local level, and they can provide solutions. They could not be just recognized as victims, but basically being recognized as part of the solution. One final point related to the SDGs. I invented something when I was at the World Bank with UNDP and UN Women. It's called SDGs and Her. And then I launched this initiative. There was a nice blog that was written, and I was very proud about this SDGs and Her. Came back to my daughter, my only daughter. I say, well, I did great today. I put a title that empowering women will help countries achieve the SDGs. She said, well, good try, but don't ever say empowering again. Oh, come on. What did I do wrong with that? Because she said, This is the new generation of women. My generation perhaps might be happy with the word empowerment. But the younger generation say, well, those who can empower would disempower if they have the mood to do that. What we need is fair chance and aspiration.
Yeah.
So this is the new generation when you invest in human capital. So for those of us who say still empower, be careful with the younger generation challenging you going forward.
We want to meet your daughter. She sounds fantastic.
I am. Welcome anytime. Yeah.
It sounds like she's really put interesting ideas in your mind. Your Excellency Preeti, and I go back to some of the lessons learned in the least developed countries and some of the plight that people face. And we're here talking, in Dubai in a wonderful auditorium, and women's suffering is continuing on the ground. Could you tell me about some of the immediate challenges that need to be absolutely addressed right now with a sense of urgency that perhaps have evolved because of the crises of late?
So look, I think challenges of healthcare and education are predominant. I think at the moment we need to make sure we have primary healthcare centers being set up. And again, I think that's a public-private financing initiative. So we would like to work on some things like that get that last mile access to the woman in the village, as you mentioned. I think for us, a digital ID, the KYC ID. So Sudan came to us and said, we have cash transfer in place, but we need to send the money. We don't know where to send it in the sense. So we need the cash, the ID or the KYC identifying how we can get to the families would be another such aspect. So those would be some of the challenges we see right away, but continuing the challenges, of course, are getting women access to education. We've been working on local infrastructure, so creating even bus terminals or social infrastructure that can transport women and reduce the risk of, danger or gender-based violence along the way.
Yeah, I come from South Africa and I know gender-based violence issues, unfortunately, firsthand, and it's something that, it's a bigger topic that needs to be discussed. If you would say the priorities, Your Excellency Preeti, would you say education, right? Well, access to food and water, education, right? Financial inclusion through a mobile phone, maybe, and then you open so many doors.
Right.
Would you put that as priorities?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
We just started with financial inclusion, and then we went to each sector, agriculture,
Everything
healthcare,
else.
education.
It opens that door,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Your Excellency, yes.
No, very quickly, just to emphasize that this is not just going to be good for women inclusion and having some positive improvement in gender, as Preeti mentioned. But basically, these are the ingredients for any kind of success to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, because we put them in the same three: investment in human capital, health and education, investment in infrastructure, including internet and IT solutions with fair access to all, and then investment in resilience, which gets us into issues related to climate. Your home country is doing a good example in that when we are talking about phasing out from coal, investing in renewables, but there is some tricky part of it. Is not really the material investments in phasing out from coal, investing in renewables. It's basically about the investment in resilience of the local community that could really be either impacted negatively by phasing out or impacted positively by phasing in renewables. And here the role of society, and it's not discovered. People say, well, we're going to be investing in women because they are macro-critical, like the IMF mentioned, like Rania mentioned. But it's not a discovery. Since the creation of this world, there have been 50-50. In some societies, actually, women are outnumbering men. If you are talking about resilience of society, it's women that are going to be the critical determining factor of success and, God forbid, failure. So let's talk success here.
Let's talk success. Thank you so much. Look, it's been so illuminating listening to both of you. Thank you, sir, for being someone that is, really taking gender at heart in everything you do. Thank you so much, Your Excellency Preeti, for doing the same. It's been such an honor. We need to have more of these conversations. And
Looking forward
thank you
to
so
that.
much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.